Hello everybody, and welcome to my Dominaria Remastered Draft Guide. In this video, I'll be providing you with all of the information you need to succeed in your Dominaria Remastered drafts. In this video, I'll be discussing the top commons, the color rankings, I will provide archetype overviews, I'll go through the combat tricks, and then discuss traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the top commons, these are the cards you will want to prioritize in your drafts because they are generically powerful and fit into a variety of decks. Starting off with white, at number 1 is Nomad Decoy. This is a pseudo removal spell because tapping creatures essentially removes them from combat, and it gets better as the game goes on thanks to the threshold mechanic, making it a great card in your deck. At number 2 is Pacifism, which, though it does have some weaknesses as a removal spell, still does answer creatures that you care about and is therefore worth picking early. And then at number 3 is Acacian Javelineers, a very flexible 1-drop for white. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is Man O' War. One of the best tempo cards ever printed is back in Dominaria Remastered, and this card is fantastic in any blue deck. At number 2 is Counter Spell, a generic answer to any card you care about, provided it has not yet entered the battlefield. It forms a potent combo with Man O' War, because if a creature that you care about has entered the battlefield, you can bounce it back to your opponent's hand and then counter it with Counter Spell. And then at number 3 is Avon Fisher, an evasive creature that provides some value when it dies, which makes it a card your opponent is going to be annoyed to deal with. Moving on to black, at number 1 is Terror, a very efficient removal spell. Even though it does have some downsides in that it can't target certain types of creatures, it is still well worth taking early and including in your deck. At number 2 is Phyrexian Rager, a great value creature. And at number 3 is Icarslick, another great removal spell that can even be a 2-for-1 if you are able to get up to 6 mana to cycle it and then pay the madness cost, which is quite effective. Moving on to red, at number 1 is Chain Lightning. It does have some downside against other red decks, but 1 mana for 3 damage is still just so efficient that it is worth taking early. At number 2 is Mogg War Marshal. 2 creatures for 1 card, all for the low cost of 2 mana is great, and if you do have that extra mana to pay the echo cost, it's even better. And then at number 3 is Solar Blast, a card that can be a little bit of a 2-for-1 if you are killing a 1 toughness creature, and otherwise is just a reasonable removal spell that can even go face if you want it to. Moving on to green, at number 1 is Werebear, a nice mana dork that can ramp you early and be a nice threat later. At number 2 is Wild Growth, one of the most devastating plays you can have on turn 1 as it sets you up for the rest of the game to have a big mana advantage. And then at number 3 is Adia Seer, which is a great 2-drop for helping you hit land drops, and also in the middle stages of the game, it can even enable some things like Madness or Graveyard synergies like Threshold. Moving on to the color rankings, the rankings are as follows. At number 1 is black, at number 2 is green, at number 3 is blue, at number 4 is red, and at number 5 is white. Now, it is worth noting that these rankings are based on the depth of commons and uncommons, how many good cards there are, and the synergies they have with each other. But it is also worth noting that none of the colors are worth forcing and none of them are worth avoiding. So they're all relatively close, and this is more of a tiebreaker if you are making a close pick. Moving on to the archetype overviews. Now, there is a caveat with this section because due to the nature of the set, because it is a remastered set, and because in older sets there were not as much of an emphasis on archetypes, the archetypes are a bit less defined than in a typical set. But still, moving to the archetypes, in red-white there is a small auras theme as well as aggression. So you can use a card like Tiana Ship's Caretaker to help you get some extra value from your auras, and you can use a card like Ridgetop Raptor, which has double strike, combined with auras like Griffin Guide to really hit your opponents hard. So get some aggression going and get some aura synergies over top of that. Moving on to blue-black, this is just a typical control deck. It'll use a card like Fact or Fiction as a great value card, and then set that up by having early drops like Nightscape Familiar to stabilize the board, make your spells cost a little bit less, and Recoil is just a fantastic little tempo/value card. Moving on to green-white, this is a color combination that cares a lot about Threshold. Mystic Enforcer is a very, very strong card, simply as just a 4-mana 3/3 pro-black that eventually grows into a 6/6 flyer if you can enable Threshold. You can use a card like Break Asunder and the cycling specifically to help fill your graveyard a bit easier, because it can sometimes be hard to fill your graveyard if your deck is just filled with creatures. And then Vigilant Sentry is a nice payoff at common for if you can enable Threshold, becoming a really scary card and making combat a nightmare for your opponent if you can enable Threshold. Moving on to blue-red, this is advertised as somewhat of a storm deck if you can use Empty the Warrens and then a bunch of cards that are pseudo-free like Frantic Search, which untaps 3 lands when you cast it to chain together a couple of spells and then cast a nice storm payoff. But it also has some nice just value elements. Quicksilver Dagger is a great uncommon, which doesn't necessarily scream go for storm. It's just a great card in your deck because if you can protect the creature that it goes on, maybe with Counterspell, then you can start to run away with the game. Moving on to green-black, this is a typical value deck. Spirit Monger is a great card in that Regenerate makes it very hard to deal with, and it can even become a color of your choice if your opponent is trying to target it with something that cares about colors, or if your opponent has a creature with protection from a specific color. Just a fantastic uncommon for this color combination. Urborg Uprising is also exactly what this deck wants to be doing. A nice 3-for-1 built into a common. And then Penumbra Bobcat is the sort of creature you'll want in this deck. Just a nice value creature that you can help use to grind out a game. Moving on to white-blue, this is a color combination that cares about getting into the air and also has some enters the battlefield shenanigans going on. Sawtooth Loon is a great flyer that also gives you a nice little bit of an enters the battlefield effect. Momentary Blink is a way to re-trigger your enter the battlefield effects while also being a nice spell to protect yourself from removal spells that your opponents might cast. And then Floodgate is a particularly good card in this sort of strategy where you have a lot of flyers and you also have ways to make it leave the battlefield so that you can potentially use it as a mini sweeper in your games. Next up is red-green. This is a classic ramp strategy, but also has the additional upside of being a cycling deck in this format. So Rada Heir to Keld is a great early drop because it can ramp you. And then you can hopefully establish an early card like Lightning Rift or Invigorating Boon to synergize with the big cycling creatures that you'll want to have in your deck. And then in the early game, you'll spend your turns cycling those creatures. And then in the later stages of the game, you'll just be able to cast your big spells. White-black is a deck that is just classic mid-range pretty much, but also has some additional upside in terms of the life gain and life loss aspect. So you can use a card like Gerard's Verdict or Cleric of the Forward Order to gain you some life in the early turns of the game, and that sets you up to cast a card like Phyrexian Scuda as a 4-mana 5/5 without having to worry about the kicker cost of paying 3 life because you'll have already assembled a bit of a life buffer. Moving on to green-blue, this is another big ramp deck. You can use Tatyova, Benthic Druid as a great value engine once you have a bunch of lands in play. And then Elvish Aberration is a nice card that you can cycle early or play late as a big creature that further ramps you. Aven Fate Shaper might not look as special as a top-end card as you might expect from a more modern set, but a 7-mana 4/5 flyer is just absolutely massive, and it'll set you up to draw better cards in the future. So it's a really good top-end threat for this sort of deck that cares about ramping. Moving on to black-red, this is one of those archetypes that is a little bit less defined. It has the uncommon Drellnu's Crusade, which buffs your goblins and also makes your goblins treated as zombies. It does have some minor goblin and zombie themes. So Gempalm Incinerator is a card that rewards you for getting a bunch of goblins in play. So Mog War Marshal, the red common we talked about earlier, that puts 2 goblins into play for 1 card, can be really good in this sort of deck, especially because it can synergize with sacrifice effects like Phyrexian Ghoul, which is a really nice threat of activation. It can attack in, and then your opponent really struggles to block it. So get a lot of creatures into play. Hopefully they're goblins, and you can leverage some additional synergy. Moving on to the combat tricks, starting off with the commons, white has access to Remedy, blue has Leaden Fists and Oven Eyes, black has Howl from Beyond, red has Lightning Reflexes, and green has Primal Boost. At uncommon, there are some of these modal cards which do involve combat tricks on some of the modes, so white gains access to Stand, green gains access to Wax, and then Night and Day is a modal card that can affect combat either from the black side by giving a creature -1/-1, or from the white side by giving all of their creatures +1/+1. So those are cards that you will want to be aware of in this set. Moving on to some traps to avoid, starting off with Crop Rotation. This card is legacy playable and often gets played in Commander and things like that, which often makes it seem like it would be good in Limited, but it's simply not really worth it to sacrifice a land to go get another land. And so it's just 2-for-1ing yourself and you're not really getting a high impact land, so just avoid playing Crop Rotation. Next is Ornithopter, another card that looks really free to include in your decks. After all, it does cost 0 mana, but these sorts of formats are often very grindy, and there's not really artifact synergies, and so just putting a 0 mana 0/2 into play is not worth the card in your deck or the card in your hand, and so you're putting yourself down a resource to play it, and Ornithopter is best left avoided. And then third is Congregate, a card that just purely gains you life. And once again, if you're just playing out a normal game, gaining some life isn't going to actually help you win. It's just going to delay the inevitable if you are behind, or if you're ahead, it's going to be taking your foot off the gas. So avoid playing that card as well. Moving on to some combos that you can assemble. The first combo, and this is a very important one, is between Horseshoe Crab and Hermetic Study. Both of these are common, both of these are in blue, and this combo can absolutely devastate a board if you don't have any interaction to deal with it. You play Horseshoe Crab, and then the next turn you put Hermetic Study on it, and then you can basically just tap Horseshoe Crab to ping something, pay a blue mana, untap it, ping another thing, untap it, and basically just mow down your opponent's board. And if your opponent's doing that to you, you're really going to want to find an answer. So this is a key combo in the set and one that you will need to be aware of. Next up is a green combination that is somewhat similar in that it involves a creature and an enchantment. Crows and Restorer has the ability to untap target land, and Squirrel Nest lets your land tap to create a 1/1. So if you can get Crows and Restorer into play and then put Squirrel Nest onto one of your land, you can generate 2 1/1s per turn, which is quite powerful. So those are just some combos you can assemble with commons and uncommons in this set. Moving on to the mana fixing, it is worth noting that it is incredibly sparse in this set and purely exists at the land slot. Green doesn't even have access to mana fixing because all of its ramp just gets extra green mana. Terminal Moraine is going to be your bread and butter fixer. It is a common, so you can find these in packs, but you are going to have to prioritize them if you want fixing, even though it does look pretty weak. It taps for colorless, or you can pay 2 and tap it to sacrifice it and get a basic land that comes into play tapped. This is your bread and butter fixer. At uncommon, there's also a cycle of 3 colored layers, which is worth noting. They do kind of put you behind on mana if you're playing them early in the game, so try to play them as your last land from hand if you are planning on playing them. It's also worth noting that they do come into play untapped, so if you are playing them as your last land from hand, they're not actually going to be setting you behind because they come into play untapped, and then you can just replay the land that they bounce on your following turn. So there's 5 of those. There's Terminal Moraine, but fixing is sparse, and so it's not going to be a huge splashing set where you're playing 5 color all the time. So keep that in mind during your drafts. Moving on to some final tips, starting off with the first one, which is prioritize the cycling lands. They are a simple way to prevent mana flood. So there's a white one, Drifting Meadow. The blue one is Remote Isle. The black one is Polluted Mire. The red one is Smoldering Crater, and the green one is Slippery Karst. Losing a game of Magic to mana flood is really, really brutal, but it can be avoided if you have some of these in your deck, where in the late game, instead of drawing lands, you're just getting redraws to draw into more spells, and that's an easy way to help mitigate flood without having to dedicate one of your spell slots to a card to prevent flood. If you can fit that into your mana base, it's incredibly powerful, and every basic land that you are upgrading into one of these cycling lands is a major power boost for your deck. So definitely take these lands early, especially if you are in a deck that has some cycling payoffs. And then the final tip isn't a gameplay tip, but a value tip, because there are valuable cards in this set. There are cards like Force of Will, and these cards can really help you pay for future drafts if you want to trade them in, or they can just be nice cards to have in your trade binder. So look them up before drafting. There are plenty of sites available that have lists of all of the valuable cards in the set, and I highly recommend looking at those before you draft in person, because you would really benefit from drafting one of these valuable cards and putting it into your collection. That is going to do it for this video, though. Thank you so much for watching. Remember that if you enjoyed it, hit the like button, subscribe for more content, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave hashtag Master of Remaster in the comments section down below. That's going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.